Hi, everybody, and welcome to this conversation with Ben Adida of VotingWorks. I'm really excited to have Ben here today because another way to think about supply chains, of course, is in these really high security, high impact things like voting, which is so critical and frankly so scrutinized right now in our society. So I'm really excited to have Ben with us today. Ben, tell us a little bit about yourself and about VotingWorks.
Yeah, it's great to chat, Luis. My name is Ben Adida. I am the executive director of VotingWorks. VotingWorks is the only nonprofit and open source vendor of election equipment in the US. We've been around for a little over 4 years, and we have the only open source voting machines in the field in actual US elections today. Um, yeah, that's a tiny little bit more about me. My background is in security and cryptography, and in running product engineering teams. So it all comes together in this election space.
Right. I mean, you've had a fascinating career arc of both doing some very theoretical cryptography is quite the right word, but you have a
It is. Yeah.
PhD in MIT and the all the high level math stuff, and then did a career in very applied consumer facing software, right?
Yeah. It maybe took me a little longer than most to realize that the parts of technology that I really like are the building, right? The actual like constructing of software and products that are used by people. So I really enjoy the security, the cryptography, but even in that space of folks thinking about security, there's always the builders and the breakers, right? The different mindsets, and I was always very much the builder mindset, and so yeah, eventually uh, going into industry and building stuff is what makes me happy.
Right. Yeah. Well, and then as I know, since we've been friends for a while,
Yeah.
you were at Mozilla, you were doing some ed tech,
Yep.
but then you came full circle back to voting when voting became such a critical national issue. Which, on behalf of all the voters of the country, thank you. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
One of the things that was exciting. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I got back into voting in 2018. So maybe a little bit before it was on everybody's mind, and I don't think I predicted the level of scrutiny and the level of attention that this field would get. So I just want to, I didn't foresee it, didn't know it was coming. It is what it is. We're in the middle of it now. So
Well,
yeah.
actually, I think that's a good. I think many people at Upstream are keenly conscious of, I would say, the inherent vulnerability of software systems,
Right.
right? And so, in fact, when I tooted about this shortly before we were recording,
Yeah.
within minutes, I got a response saying, "Shouldn't this all be on paper?"
Mhm.
I assume you've got the fairly short answer to that, which I know in part includes printers.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So the a tiny little bit of history about voting technology, especially in the U.S. We've been using technology for a very long time in voting, for more than 100 years, and it's we moved away from paper ballot. Well, some technology didn't use paper, but roughly we had paper ballots, punch cards, optical scan in the late 20th century. And then we started moving away from paper to pure electronics at the very end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st. And it wasn't until security folks, who frankly were not paying that much attention to voting until after Florida 2000, it wasn't until then that we started saying, wait a minute, what is this idea of moving away from paper for voting? And then, thanks to organizations like Verified Voting and others, moved us back to paper in the 2010s. And now we're at a point where almost every vote in the US is cast on paper again. There's plenty of technology involved, but there's a paper ballot. The short answer to why a paper ballot has to do with the very unique nature of voting, which is that the only time that a voter can confirm that their vote was correctly recorded is in the voting booth, or maybe at the kitchen table if you're voting by mail, looking at their paper ballot. That's the only time there's no mediation between the vote of record and the person's eyes, right? which, by the way, brings up a whole question about voters with disabilities, which we can talk about at some point, but it may be in another conversation. Because your vote should be secret, no matter what you want. Like, even if you want to shout your vote from the rooftops, the system shouldn't allow you to prove how you voted, so that you can't be bribed, you can't be threatened, and all of that stuff. That's really why we use paper, because we can't keep a record of how you voted. That would be bad, but we need to give you confidence that your vote was recorded properly. And when you put those requirements together, there's nothing other than paper that can really meet that requirement.
Yeah, I mean, we'll share when this is posted. There's a terrific video about one of your first rollouts in the state of Mississippi that does show some of the details about exactly how that verification happens. I do think that leads us into one of the things that really jumped out, and why I asked you to come talk to us at Upstream today, Ben, was this notion of the chain of custody. We're here talking today about supply chains, and voting machines have a very, I think, important and thoughtful variation that you call the chain of custody. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, if you talk to election administrators, and if you don't, by the way, then one thing you can do is you can go be a poll worker, which I strongly recommend for anybody who's even mildly interested in this. And one of the things you'll learn very quickly in your training and in the process is that chain of custody is second nature to election administrators. Everything they do has to do with maintaining a strong chain of custody over every aspect of the system. The paper ballots when they're printed and delivered, the blank paper ballots, the filled in paper ballots after they're cast so they can be safely stored and potentially eventually audited, the equipment that's used. So if there's optical scanners, precinct scanners that are used, securing those, seals on everything with numbers that are recorded when they're broken, logs at the polls so poll workers can log any odd events or any unexpected development. You have this constant approach of maintaining a strong chain of custody and being later able to investigate if there's any inconsistencies. It is exactly how election administrators work. And that applies, of course, to the equipment itself, right? So when it's not being used, it should be locked away with a seal in a safe facility so that no one who shouldn't have access to it is ever touching it, worried about software modifications or denial of service attacks just by breaking the equipment, that kind of thing. Yeah, it is second nature to election administrators, and of course it's important.
Well, actually, let me stop you there for a second, because
yeah.
it's so second nature that I think you actually dropped the key. When they say chain of custody, like, what do they mean by custody? You mean like literally who is in control and documenting? Because you've talked about each of the steps, but you mean at the highest level, you mean something like, first it was controlled by this person or
Yes.
entity, we recorded it. Then in the chain, the next link is the next entity, right? I mean, that's
right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'll connect it to the paper ballot and the needs of voting too, because it's important to understand that part. If your vote didn't have to be secret, there wouldn't have to be nearly as much of a focus on chain of custody, because you could just have a list of like, Luis voted for so-and-so, Ben voted for so-and-so, and we could all check that list, and there'd be a record of it, and we don't really care how it got transmitted or whatnot. You can check it at the end. But because we don't have that record, we can't have that record ever. The only thing we can do is have this moment where your identity and your ballot are separated at the moment of casting the ballot. And from there on, we had to be really careful with those ballots, right? Because if some of them get destroyed or others get added, what do? You can't recover from that, right? There's no recovery. So the concept of chain of custody comes from that in the voting space. And you're right that it has to do with, who had control over this at any given time and making sure that chain never breaks.
right. Well, and that, of course, is where software both comes in and is terrifying, right? Because I think everybody watching this knows control over software is a sort of a slippery notion, right? So tell us a little bit more about how VotingWorks thinks about that.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about how the general industry and the regulatory environment thinks about it, and then tell you about some of the stuff we're doing in VotingWorks. First, it's generally accepted that all of the voting equipment that we use should be offline. So there's a build process that produces a software build that's installed on hardware, and from there on, there's nothing that's ever touches the internet. There are some exceptions to that. We can get into it at another point, but like generally, that's the accepted approach. The exceptions don't make people happy, just to be clear, but there are some, for pragmatic reasons, some exceptions to that. Not in VotingWorks equipment, I should say. we don't connect our machines to the internet.
I was going to say, are your machines even internet enabled at all?
No. We disable network connectivity in hardware as much as we can, and definitely in software too, right? So you can't do anything like that. So the way that the industry generally thinks about this is there are testing labs that are there to certify voting equipment, and they are responsible for performing the build of the software. And they have requirements like having the ability to, having like a bill of materials on the software, right? Like what libraries do you use and whatnot. It's probably could be a little stricter and a little more standardized how they do that, but they do have the notion of, we need to know what you're putting into this thing, right? Like what are the COTS components? What are the custom components? Like all of that. And then they do the build. Like the vendors do not build their own software. They have to ship the software to the testing lab, and the testing lab performs the build. And then there's this slightly hand-wavy process of, and election administrators can do a hash check on the machines that have been installed to make sure the software hasn't been modified. And I say hand-wavy because everybody understands that these hash checks are like somewhat helpful, but not really providing the level of confidence that we want. Like, who's doing the hashing? Where's that executable being run from, right? What are the actual bytes that are read off the hard drive? So there's a little bit of hand waving here around that hash check that we think at VotingWorks could be done better. And so we're trying to introduce some better approaches to that, which I can tell you about if you'd like. So first, we're the only open source vendor out there. So the first thing in our chain of custody is you can go look at all of our requirements right now on GitHub. You can see our dependencies, which packages we use and whatnot, which versions and whatnot. So that's the first thing that we do that I think I really wish every vendor would do in this space, because it's democracy. It's counting ballots. It's not rocket science, like the transparency is more important than the secrecy of the source code on this, in my opinion, by a very, very large margin. So that's where you start. Then there's an entire question about the build process, right? And I'm going to tell you where we want to be. We're not exactly there yet, but we're putting the pieces together for that. We want to have reproducible builds so that you can take the source code and get to the exact same bits that we get to, that the lab gets to, really. In fact, reproducible builds would be really helpful in the interactions with testing labs, because we can do the build, they can do the build, we can end up in the same place, and then they could digitally sign it, but they don't actually have to send us the build, right? Because we have the same exact bits. So there's actually, in practice, some really immediate benefits if we can get to that place. Then there's a question of, when you have it installed on a machine, how do you know that it's the actual, what is the blessed build, right? And that's where we want binary transparency. Again, these two things, we don't have them yet, but we're working towards them, and we hope to have them very soon. And to be clear, no one has them in this space, right? We don't have reproducible builds. We don't have binary transparency, not even close. I think we need to get there as an industry. Now, some stuff that we're doing at VotingWorks that we have achieved that other vendors have not achieved, that we think is really important. It's actually not required in the latest federal standards, but we think it probably should be. And that is, we use attestation features of the hardware to enable election administrators to check that the system hasn't been tampered with at the software level from when they received it, right? And remember, these things are offline, right? So you have to be a little bit creative about how you can make that work. But they are roughly the attestation features that are used with TPM chips and whatnot, and the way Chromebooks do this, right? Which is using secure boot, using DM Verity to be able to check the entire hard drive and say, yes, the hard drive matches this hash, right? And we won't boot unless you have that. But not just we won't boot, we won't unlock the secret key that this machine has in the TPM unless it boots perfectly. And that secret key is tied to a public key that has a certificate from VotingWorks. So basically, if the machine is in a healthy state, is running the code that it should be running, then it has the ability to digitally sign statements to attest that it is still this blessed machine that came from VotingWorks. Why does this matter? It matters because we're seeing all these stories of local election administrators who, for a few minutes, gave access to their warehouse to folks of questionable intent, right? And what do you do when that's happened? Well, in some cases, you've seen it happen in Georgia. They had to basically replace equipment because they just don't have a sense of how bad it got. Now, in all likelihood, nothing bad happened to the equipment, but how do you know?
The chain of custody was violated. And
Exactly. The chain of custody was violated, and that's the chain of custody after everything's been installed. So we talked about everything to, build the software, but you got to worry about this equipment being in warehouses for years, right? This is going to be used for 5, 10, sometimes 20 years.
right.
What's going on?
But only for a few days each of those years.
That's right. Only for a few days each of those years. So what happens the rest of the time, right? And what can election administrators do to gain high confidence that this machine is still running the software that it should be running? And using that attestation stack, we are able to basically have a user interface that brings up a QR code on the screen that you can scan with your phone and get a green check mark that says, yep, that is chances are, unless somebody carried out a multi-million-dollar attack on that piece of hardware, that's still running the same software it was running when we installed it.
That is so interesting. So I want to make one observation, and then I want to ask one question as a follow-up there. So one observation is that this is some of these techniques that you mentioned, I mean, the TPM chips are obviously start in hardware, but
yes.
The verification tools and all that, and Chrome OS, as you mentioned, a lot of that is open source techniques that were developed for industry, developed to validate that servers are coming up without being tampered with, and you're repurposing those, which is, I think, a success story for open source, that these things are able to be repurposed. I don't think that folks had your use case in mind, but magic of open source.
Right. Well, we talk a lot about how a lot of these techniques were really for DRM, and we're reapplying them to secure voting machines. That's a pretty good repurposing, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a whole separate, maybe next year at Upstream, we'll end up talking some about DRM and AI. I think there's some interesting conversation to be had there, but that's not our conversation today. The second thing that I was going to say is more of a question. One theme that's been sort of coming up both in this conference, but also in other conversations in this space right now, sometimes people feel like open source is being held to a higher standard for security because it can. Is that something that you find in your, because it sounds like sort of in this case, open source might be leading the way in security rather than being perceived as trailing. Have you seen that dynamic or the reverse of that dynamic?
Yes, it's kind of an out of sight, out of mind situation, right? And now we spent a lot of time thinking about open source analogies, which, Luis, I know you know probably as good as anyone. What is the right analogy? The latest analogy I use when I talk about open source in the voting space is you go to a restaurant that has an open window onto the kitchen versus a restaurant where you don't see the kitchen, right? And what do you do when you don't see the kitchen? You don't think about the kitchen. It doesn't even come up, right? You're not thinking about oh, I wonder if that kitchen's dirty. I wonder what are the quality, are they putting quality avocados in this guacamole, right? But if you got an open kitchen, then you do think about it. And on the one hand, you do get that oversight of, yeah, the chefs are being watched, right? And so probably they're just going to be a little bit careful about how they do their job, which is great. That is the kind of oversight we want. At VotingWorks, our open source is true open source in that every commit's going out on GitHub as we're building it, right? There's no cleanup moment. There's no oh, let's go clean up the comments we put in there, right? No, if that is all happening live. But you're absolutely right that if it's not happening live, then it's out of sight, out of mind. People don't think about it. And so, yes, I think the bar is a little higher, but I think that's the point, at least in my field, right? Mm-hmm. The point is, I am raising the bar on our work by exposing our work to the world. It's the same reason we're a nonprofit, right? I'm adding constraints in our financial disclosures to make sure that we are doing the right thing as an organization. we all know humans are fallible. There's no like evil people and good people. We all have the capacity to do good and bad things. And so setting up structures that entice us, that encourage us, that constrain us towards the good, that's a really powerful thing. And that's what open source does in voting for me.
That's awesome. Well, let's switch a little bit. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about your hardware, because I'm
Yeah.
sure some folks listening to this are curious about that.
Yeah.
I watched this video that folks can search How We Vote Here on YouTube to watch
Yeah.
this video. Great 15-minute video.
Thank you.
I was struck by, you had to roll out new hardware from first launch to a general election in 11 weeks.
Yep.
Which that sounds terrifying. I mean, how did you? I mean, it feels like bringing software like iteration speed to a conservative for a great reason space, right? I mean, how's that work for you all?
So I should set some context. We were doing this in Mississippi, in a county that had what voting folks call DREs, direct recording by electronic machines, 20-year-old machines that have no paper trail, and that were also at the end of their life. So they're breaking down. These machines are not working very well. And the county doesn't have a lot of money to upgrade. That's all mentioned in the video, right? In that scenario, it makes sense to take a little bit of risk and iterate quickly. In a scenario where a county has voting equipment that has paper and it's working okay for them, that would not be the right trade-off, right? Because you don't, the line we've always given at VotingWorks is, we can take some risks for VotingWorks. We can't take some risks for democracy, right? Like, that's not our purview. So it's important for me to set that context. But we chose to do that. We didn't have to. We could have let the county keep working with their old machines that were falling apart, and like, no one required us to do that. But as you know, iteration is how you build a good product, right? And like, taking the feedback, quickly moving on it, using the constraints of time, these help you focus your product effort. That's nothing special. It's not open source specific. That's just like a generally good practice. Now, the constraints of elections are pretty special, because you don't get an extra day no matter how much you ask, right? Like that deadline is as hard as any deadline has ever been. And so it's impressive how stressful that can be, right? Because in most situations that you set a deadline, but you can probably push it a day or two, right? Like, that's okay. That never, ever happens in elections, right? Like, if anything, you get surprised and the deadline moves up because of some parameter you didn't know about, right? So yeah, that was stressful, but also there's something, it's unless you're in it, it's hard to relay this, but like, we ran our first election in August 2019. And as we say in the video, it wasn't perfect. I think I gave it a C- or something. We passed, but like barely, right, in our first election. And there were so many things we learned. The thing is too heavy. It's not easy enough for poll workers to set up. The thing you always forget, the voters liked it fine, could be better. They liked it fine, but the poll workers, like, I can't set this up. They needed us to set it up, right? So we needed to completely redesign it for the poll worker to be able to set it up and tear it down. When you come away from working a 18-hour day, which is what an election day usually is, right? And you slept almost none at all the night before because you're stressed like mad because your first voting machine is going to be used in an election, and you've been running on adrenaline for 24 hours. And the next day you go, oh my God, we actually ran an election on our machine. And like, we have so many learnings from it, but it worked. The amount of energy we had, we were 4 people at this little Mississippi restaurant where we ate for 5 straight hours and paid $33 or something ridiculous for the amount of food we had. And the conversation we had around, like, we've learned so much, now we've got to go and make this better. Like, we just had infinite energy to do that at that moment, right? Just from the excitement of that. And so, yeah, we were able to get that iteration. And you're right, we were applying software style iteration to the hardware. We're not doing giant numbers, right? I say we're not doing giant numbers, but we did produce 50 of those machines we designed and produced 50 of those machines in 10 weeks. So yeah, we did quite a bit. Still, it was for the same reasons that software iteration can get you really excited and pumped, is you see what you want to build and you can go ahead and build it. But what the video doesn't have time to tell you is like, we got plenty of stress and things that happened in that election too, right? And we learned from that, and we kept making it better. So yeah.
Well, I mean that's the nature of software iteration.
Yeah.
One thing it seems like I don't think was touched on too heavily in the video because it's sort of more for a general audience. But you are using a lot of general purpose. You mentioned in passing Chrome OS. You're using a lot of general purpose, commercially available hardware as sort of the core of your system.
Yep.
Talk a little bit more about why that works for you practically and philosophically.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, we started with a very strong commitment to using COTS hardware everywhere we could, right? And we've kept to that commitment for the most part, but that's actually had to evolve because of some very specific voting requirements where we're still using COTS electronics, but a lot of the enclosures we're making, a lot of the, some of that's becoming more and more custom just because we have to, because a precinct scanner has to interface with a voter in a very, very particular way. But the general feeling was, if we can use COTS equipment, we will go faster. We'll have a very reliable and secure supply chain. You can't target VotingWorks because we don't have a VotingWorks supply chain. We have we're tapping into a supply chain that's secured for lots of other reasons, right? And that's been true to a certain degree. Except, like I said, in some components that are turning out to be like, oh, we're going to have to do things a little bit more custom here. It's allowed us to move really fast. Using open source software has allowed us to move really fast, right? Like, that's not new, but maybe it's newer in voting machines. So,
right. Yeah. Right. Well, and it lets you build on all that. Well, I mean, is that a two-edged? I guess we sort of already covered this a little bit, right? But it does feel like there's this two-edged sword of it allows you to move fast, but there's a lot of awareness right now with things like Log4j that it has some trade-offs. Because I mean, you've already talked a little bit with your own software about how you think that trade-off is worthwhile, actually pushes you in good direction.
Yeah.
Is enough of the rest of your stack, as you say, sort of validated and secured by the Chrome OS team and others that you worry less about that? Or
and a quick clarification, we do like Chrome OS, but we don't use Chrome OS. So
okay.
We're using similar techniques, but we're not using Chrome OS itself.
Oh, okay. Right.
We get this huge win from being not internet connected, right? Look at a lot of these vulnerabilities. They can't really be exploited that easily when you're not internet connected. Now, that doesn't mean we don't pay attention to them, right?
Sure.
But it does mean that it's significant. The risk is significantly more. We've got a containment basically around some of these things, right? It gives us time to react. It gives us time to address them in a way that our machines don't become vulnerable overnight, right? It's never happened. It could happen in the future, but that part's never happened. So we get a win from that. And we get a win from continued defense in depth. If you think of not being internet connected as a layer of defense, which it is, it's a very nice layer of defense. There's other things that we're always thinking about and trying to figure out how to do. So we have, we have an electron process, like everything is running in Chromium with an electron process. On the voter facing component, we kill it every 5 minutes and restart it, right? So okay, that's another layer of defense. If somebody manages to modify that thing, well, okay, in memory, in the JavaScript context, it'll go bye-bye, right? And we're thinking about continuing to do that at many different levels where, it could be like a Docker container that spins up and just runs the entire stack long enough for one voter and then dies and comes back, right? There's all sorts of things we can do to keep building these layers, because ultimately the flip side of not being internet connected is we can't ship a patch, right? We can't just go patch these machines. Even if we had the ability to go in the field and update all of them very quickly in a certification regime, that still has to go through some level of certification. That could be an accelerated one, could be only 1 month, right? But the point is, you're going to have those layers of defense, because if there is a serious problem, it's going to take weeks and weeks to deploy that to customers. And it's actually a reason, and I know this is not the main topic today, but it's actually a reason why vulnerability disclosure in the space of voting systems has some pretty weird requirements, right? It's that need to be thought about carefully. So, yeah.
Oh, that's super interesting. Ben, this has been really terrific. I can't stress enough how amazing it is that you're doing this and leading this effort.
Thank you.
because it is so important for all of us. And I really appreciate it and find it. I hope folks like it. I've shown the GitHub URL,
Yeah.
the YouTube search. Highly recommend. It's just an interesting window into this part of, like you say, you're looking into the kitchen. And in fact, one of our keynotes this morning was about open source as a fine dining kitchen.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, and I think there's a lot to be learned here both ways. So very exciting. Thank you so much for your time, Ben. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.